On the cold morning of November the 8th, 1965, a hairdresser let herself into a quiet townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and climbed the stairs through a house that was still asleep. She made her way up to a bedroom on the third floor, a room the lady of the house almost never used, and there she found something she would never forget. Sitting upright in the bed was Dorothy Kilgallen, one of the most famous women in America. She was dead at the age of just 52. She had been alive and poised and on national television in front of millions of people only a handful of hours before. Now, the house was silent, and one of the most recognizable women in the entire country was simply gone. For a moment, the scene looked almost ordinary. A book lay near the bed. A lamp was still burning. But almost nothing about that room would turn out to be ordinary at all. Dorothy Kilgallen had never been an ordinary woman. And as the world would slowly realize, this was not going to be an ordinary death. She was the star of a hit television program, a guessing game called What's My Line, watched by tens of millions of Americans on Sunday nights. She wrote a newspaper column, The Voice of Broadway, that ran in more than 140 papers, stretching from coast to coast. Her name sold those papers. Her opinion could lift a struggling Broadway show overnight, or quietly help to bury one. Editors paid her handsomely for it, and the most powerful people in entertainment took enormous care to stay on her good side, because they understood what a single line from her could do to them. In the world of New York media, she was a genuine power all by herself. And in the final weeks of her life, she had begun saying something to the people around her, something that would soon sound far less like gossip and far more like a warning. She told friends she was close to the biggest story of her entire career, a story she believed would change the way the whole country understood a national tragedy. Just days before she died, she reportedly told someone she trusted, "In 5 more days, I am going to bust this case wide open." The case was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. 2 years earlier in Dallas, the president had been shot dead in front of the entire world, and the man accused of killing him was himself murdered on live television just 2 days after that. Most of the country accepted the official answer about who was responsible. Dorothy Kilgallen did not. She had decided very early on that the simple version of the story did not add up, and this was a woman with a long, proven track record of being right precisely when the official version of events turned out to be wrong. She had seen the inside of too many courtrooms to take a tidy answer on faith. She had also done something no other reporter in America had managed to do. She had gotten to the one living man who might have been able to explain the whole thing. And she had been keeping everything she learned inside a private file, a file she carried with her almost everywhere she went, and guarded as if her life depended on it. Within a short time of her death, that file, along with the notes for the book she had been writing, could no longer be found. They have never been recovered to this day. The city of New York ruled that she had died from a combination of alcohol and barbiturate sleeping pills. On paper, the verdict was simple. It was an accident. But the details refused to sit quietly. She was found in a room she almost never slept in, dressed in clothing she had not been wearing when she came home that evening. The book resting beside her was one that she had already finished reading. Each detail was small on its own, but taken together, they raised a question that has never truly gone away. Did Dorothy Kilgallen simply die, the way the official record says she did? Or did someone decide to make absolutely certain that she would never finish what she had started? To understand why that question still matters, 60 years later, you first have to understand who she really was. Not the rumor and not the legend, the actual person. Because long before the conspiracy theories and the missing file, Dorothy Kilgallen was something much more straightforward. She was, quite simply, the hardest working woman in American journalism. This is a story about ambition and about courage and about the strange narrow place where great fame and real danger finally meet. She had built her name the slow and difficult way, word by word, deadline by deadline, inside a business that did not expect very much from women at all. As a young reporter in 1936, she had raced around the entire world using only public transportation, finishing in just 24 days and making headlines from coast to coast. She had interviewed film stars and convicted murderers and sitting presidents. She had sat in the press rows at the most sensational criminal trials of her century. She had earned powerful friends and equally powerful enemies. And from everything we know, she did not appear to be especially frightened of either one. By 1965, she had reached a place that very few journalists ever reach in a lifetime. She was famous simply for being famous, and at the same time, genuinely respected for being right. And then, she turned all of that hard-won fame and influence directly toward the single most dangerous subject in the entire country. What she found, and what it may ultimately have cost her, is the very heart of the story we are about to tell. We will follow her from a child in a struggling newspaper family to the brightest lights of national television, and finally to a quiet bedroom where the lights were switched off for good. Along the way, we will carefully separate what is genuinely documented from what is only believed, because a story this serious deserves to be handled with real care. This is the story of the reporter who knew too much and of the questions she left behind. So let us begin, as she would have wanted, at the very beginning. Dorothy May Kilgallen was born in Chicago on the 3rd of July, 1913, into a family where the newspaper business was not so much a career as it was a way of life. Her father, James Lawrence Kilgallen, was a reporter for the wire services, a roving correspondent who chased the biggest stories of the early 20th century from one city to the next. He was good at it. He covered crimes and disasters and famous trials, and he taught his daughter, almost without meaning to, that a real reporter walks toward the story when everyone else is backing away. The family moved often in Dorothy's early years before finally settling in Brooklyn, New York, around 1920, when her father took a steady post as a correspondent based in the city. She grew up Catholic, sharp-tongued and watchful, the kind of child who noticed everything and forgot almost nothing. Her younger sister Eleanor would remember her as relentlessly, almost frighteningly determined. She enrolled at the College of New Rochelle, a Catholic women's college just north of the city. But a quiet classroom was never going to be able to hold her for very long. After only 2 semesters, she dropped out to take a job that most young women of her time could only dream about. She became a reporter for the New York Evening Journal. The journal was a Hearst paper, loud and competitive, and forever hungry for a scoop. Its pages ran thick with crime, scandal, and spectacle, and its reporters were expected to fight tooth and nail for every story they got. It was not a gentle place to learn the trade. For a young woman like Dorothy, it was absolutely perfect. She was still a teenager when she started, one of very few women in a newsroom full of hard-drinking, fast-talking men who quietly assumed she would not last the year. She lasted. She covered crime, the courts, and the strange human dramas of the city, and she learned to write fast and clean, with an opening line that made a reader keep going. Before long, she was covering murder trials, sitting in crowded courtrooms and filing vivid dispatches that placed the reader right there in the room, in the chair beside her. Then, in the autumn of 1936, her newspaper handed her an assignment that would turn her into a national name almost overnight. Two rival reporters from two rival New York papers were going to race each other all the way around the world, using only the kind of transportation any ordinary traveler could buy a ticket for. The journal wanted in on the contest. And to the surprise of nearly everyone involved, the reporter the paper chose to carry its flag was a young woman barely past her 23rd birthday. Dorothy Kilgallen set off against two men, Bud Ekins and Leo Kieran, carrying little more than a suitcase, a typewriter, and a deadline that never once stopped moving. She crossed oceans by steamship and continents by propeller plane and railway, filing breathless dispatches at every stop that ran on the front page back home in New York. She circled the entire globe in roughly 24 days, 12 hours, and 52 minutes, crossing oceans by steamship and continents by air, while readers back home followed every single leg of the journey on the front page. Accounts differ on exactly where she placed among the three of them, but on the only measure that truly mattered, she had already won. Because while the two men were largely forgotten, it was the young woman from Brooklyn whose name readers remembered. Her dispatches were gathered into a book called Girl Around the World. Hollywood took notice. Her adventure helped inspire a motion picture, and for a short while, Dorothy tried her hand out west, working under contract as a screenwriter. But the movie business bored her. The deadlines were too soft, and the stakes felt too low. She missed the noise of the newsroom and the electric snap of a real story breaking. So she came home to New York, and in 1938 she began the thing that would come to define the rest of her professional life, a daily newspaper column called The Voice of Broadway. At first it was show business news: who was opening, who was closing, and who had been seen with whom at the Stork Club, at El Morocco, and at the other glittering night spots of Manhattan. To get it, she worked those rooms herself, night after night, long after the other columnists had gone home to bed. But Dorothy was never content to simply reprint whatever a press agent handed her. She dug, she cultivated her own sources, and she printed the things that other people were afraid to print. Over the years, the column grew and grew, until it was syndicated in more than 140 newspapers all across the United States. Millions of people read her words every single day. To be mentioned by Dorothy Kilgallen was to matter. To be ignored by her was its own kind of quiet verdict. publicists feared her, and the biggest stars in the country actively courted her, sending gifts and invitations and carefully worded tips, all hoping for a favorable line and dreading an unfavorable one. She had become, almost without anyone deciding it, one of the single most powerful voices in all of American entertainment. And she was still only in her 20s. In her private life, things were moving every bit as fast. In 1940, she married Richard Colmar, a handsome and ambitious Broadway actor and producer. They made a glamorous match, two bright young figures of the New York scene, and they soon settled into an enormous apartment on Park Avenue with room enough for a growing family. They would go on to have 3 children together over the years. And in time, the couple turned even their own breakfast table into a broadcast. Starting in 1945, the two of them hosted a live radio program called Breakfast with Dorothy and Dick, broadcast 5 mornings a week on the New York station WOR, directly from inside their own sprawling 16-room apartment on Park Avenue. Over coffee poured by their butler, the two of them chatted about Broadway, nightlife, and the gossip of the city. And listeners across New York felt as if they were sitting right there at the table. By the end of the 1940s, Dorothy Kilgallen had built something genuinely remarkable. A powerful column, a famous marriage, a hit radio show, and a name known in nearly every American household. And yet, the one thing that would make her face truly unforgettable to an audience of tens of millions of people had not even begun. That part of the story came with television. Television arrived in American living rooms after the Second World War, like a kind of household magic. And in 1950, it offered Dorothy Kilgallen a stage far larger than any newspaper ever could. That year, she joined the panel of a brand new program on CBS, a quiet little guessing game called What's My Line? Broadcast live on Sunday nights, it would go on to run for the next 15 years, and her seat on that panel made her face familiar in millions of homes that no newspaper column could ever have reached. The premise was simple, almost gentle. A panel of well-dressed New Yorkers tried to guess the unusual occupation of an ordinary guest, using nothing but a string of polite yes or no questions. The host was the urbane John Charles Daly. The panel changed over the years, but Dorothy Kilgallen became its sharpest and most reliable mind, week after week after week. She was small and precise and very quick, and she had a way of narrowing a mystery down with just a few careful questions that left the studio audience genuinely amazed. The highlight of every broadcast came when a famous mystery guest arrived, and the panel pulled on black satin blindfolds to guess the celebrity's identity by voice and by clue alone. Behind those blindfolds sat some of the most recognizable people in the entire world, the biggest film stars and singers and public figures of the age. And beside them, every Sunday, sat Dorothy, listening harder than anyone else in the room. Time and again, she would identify the hidden celebrity from a single spoken word or a single careful clue, leaving the studio audience gasping at how quickly her mind had worked. For tens of millions of Americans, this was how they came to know her, not as a byline buried in a newspaper, but as a face, elegant, witty, and entirely, unmistakably herself. It created a strange and remarkable double life. By night, she was a glamorous television star. beamed into living rooms from one coast of the country to the other. By day, she was something else entirely, a working newspaper woman with a hard deadline and a column that could shake some of the most powerful people in the country. Because while What's My Line made her beloved, it was the Voice of Broadway column that made her genuinely feared. By the height of her career, that column was running in well over 100 newspapers, read by millions, and almost nobody in all of show business was truly beyond its reach. A favorable line from Dorothy Kilgallen could fill a theater overnight. An unfavorable one could leave a famous star explaining himself for weeks. Press agents planted items with her and prayed that she would bite, and the people who crossed her learned to dread the morning paper. She knew exactly how much power she held, and she was not afraid to use that power, even against the single most powerful entertainer of the entire age, which brings us, inevitably, to Frank Sinatra. For a few years, Dorothy and the singer had actually been on friendly terms. But in 1956, she wrote a long multi-part front-page series titled The Real Frank Sinatra Story. It dug into his temper, his associations, and the wide gap between his polished public image and the man underneath, and it ran across the front pages of papers all over the country. The singer was furious, and the singer did not forgive. From the stage of his nightclub acts in New York and in Las Vegas, he began mocking her cruelly, ridiculing her appearance and calling her names in front of laughing crowds. He reportedly nicknamed her the Chinless Wonder, and on one occasion, he even sent her a tombstone as a so-called gift. It was about as ugly as a celebrity feud could ever get. A lesser columnist might have softened or simply moved along to safer and easier targets. Dorothy Kilgallen did neither. She just kept writing exactly what she found. That refusal to flinch was not merely stubbornness. It came from a deep and genuine conviction that her one real job was to print the truth, no matter who it happened to embarrass. Nowhere was that instinct clearer than in her coverage of crime, and of one murder trial in particular, years before the name Dallas would mean anything at all. In 1954, a respectable Ohio doctor named Sam Shepard was accused of the brutal murder of his pregnant wife. Almost overnight, the case became a national sensation. Dorothy traveled to Cleveland to cover the trial, and what she saw in that courtroom troubled her deeply. She simply did not believe the prosecution had proven its case. The trial judge, a man named Edward Blythen, recognized the famous columnist the very moment she arrived. Remarkably, he asked the reporter covering his courtroom for her autograph. And then, according to Dorothy, the judge said something genuinely extraordinary. Before a single witness had testified, he told her the case was open and shut. He said Shepard was, in his words, guilty as hell. If it was true, it was a stunning admission. A judge sworn to be perfectly impartial had apparently already decided the verdict before the trial had even begun. When the jury did convict Shepard, Dorothy was openly shocked, and she said so in print in a banner front-page headline to an enormous national audience. Her criticism was so sharp and so public that one Cleveland newspaper actually dropped her column in protest. She did not take a single word of it back. Years later, in 1966, the year after Dorothy's own death, The Supreme Court of the United States would overturn Shepard's conviction, pointing to exactly the kind of prejudice and circus atmosphere that Dorothy had condemned from the very start. She had trusted her own eyes over the official story, and history had ultimately proven her right. It was a lesson she would quietly carry with her for the rest of her life. By the early 1960s, Dorothy Kilgallen stood at the absolute peak of American media. A television star, a feared columnist, and a crime reporter with a proven nose for a cover-up. She had spent an entire lifetime learning how to tell when an official story did not quite hold together, and how to keep pulling at the loose thread, until at last something gave. So when the most shocking crime of the century unfolded on live television in November of 1963, Dorothy Kilgallen did exactly what she had always done. She started asking questions. On November the 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed as his open motorcade moved slowly through the crowded streets of the city. It was a Friday, just after midday, as the cars rolled through an open area known as Dealey Plaza. In an instant, the entire nation stopped breathing. Within hours, the police had arrested a former Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald and charged him with the murder of the president and of a Dallas police officer. Oswald denied everything. In front of the reporters crowded into the police station, he insisted that he was, in his own words, just a patsy. He would never get the chance to say it in a court of law. 2 days later, as Oswald was being transferred through the basement of the Dallas police headquarters, a local nightclub owner stepped out of the press of bodies and shot him dead. The killer's name was Jack Ruby, and he had done it in front of live television cameras while completely surrounded by dozens of armed police officers. In the space of just 48 hours, the one man who could have answered for the president's murder had himself been silenced forever. Tens of millions of Americans watched it happen on their screens. For many of them, that second killing was the precise moment the official story first began to feel just a little too neat to be entirely true. The official machinery moved quickly. A commission led by Chief Justice Earl Warren was created to investigate, and over the following months it would hear from hundreds of witnesses and gather thousands of pages of testimony. In time, it would conclude that both Oswald and Ruby had acted entirely alone. One troubled man, the commission said, had killed the president. Another troubled man had then killed him. There was no wider plot. 2 lone gunmen and nothing more. Most of the country, exhausted and grieving, accepted that answer. It was simpler, and it was far easier to live with than any of the alternatives. Dorothy Kilgallen did not accept it. To her, the idea that these 2 men had each acted completely alone, purely by coincidence, was, in her own word, laughable. She had sat through enough trials and chased down enough cover-ups to know exactly how a tidy official story can be carefully built on top of a much messier truth. And one single piece of it bothered her more than all the rest combined. Jack Ruby. He owned a striptease nightclub in Dallas called the Carousel, and he had a long and tangled web of connections to local police officers and to the criminal underworld of the city. Who was he, really? And why on earth had he actually done it? A nightclub owner with underworld connections does not usually walk into a police basement and execute the most important prisoner in the world simply to spare a grieving widow the pain of a trial. It did not add up. So when Jack Ruby went on trial for murder in Dallas in the early months of 1964, Dorothy Kilgallen was there, sitting in the courtroom, watching absolutely everything. The trial was presided over by a judge named Joe Brown, and it drew reporters from all over the world. But Dorothy Kilgallen was not like all the other reporters in that room. She had spent 25 years building relationships, trading careful favors, and earning the kind of deep trust that opens doors which stay firmly closed to everyone else. And in Dallas, those doors opened for her. Dorothy Kilgallen managed to do something that not one single other journalist covering the entire case was able to do. She got to Jack Ruby in private. Away from the cameras and away from the crowd, she was reportedly granted a few minutes alone with the one man at the very center of it all. The exact details of that meeting are still debated to this day. Some accounts place it in the judge's chambers during the trial. Others describe a brief private conversation elsewhere. What is far less in doubt is that the conversation truly happened and that it left a deep mark on her. She came away more convinced than ever that the official story was incomplete. Whatever Jack Ruby actually said to Dorothy Kilgallen in those few minutes, she kept it very close. She did not splash it across her column the following morning. Instead, she began to treat the Kennedy assassination not as a story to report just once, but as a genuine case to investigate, carefully and quietly, over a long stretch of time. It was an extraordinary decision. She was a gossip columnist and a game show panelist, choosing to take on the single most scrutinized crime in all of American history. But Dorothy had something that most investigators completely lacked. She had access. She had fame that worked like a kind of armor, and she had a national platform to publish whatever she found. And she soon proved that her access went far beyond a single conversation with Ruby. She got her hands on something that the government had badly wanted to keep secret. In the summer of 1964, before the Warren Commission had even released its official findings, Dorothy obtained a copy of Jack Ruby's secret sworn testimony to the commission. Ruby had given that testimony in Dallas that June, when Chief Justice Warren himself traveled down to question him behind closed doors. This was classified material. It was the transcript of a closed-door session. By every rule of the game, she should never have been able to hold it in her hands at all. And she did what a truly great reporter does with a truly great scoop. In August of 1964, she published it, running the secret testimony in the pages of the Journal American. It was a genuine sensation and a deep embarrassment to the authorities. The most secret words of the man who had killed Oswald were suddenly there for absolutely anyone to read. Someone, somewhere deep inside the official investigation, had quietly handed Dorothy Kilgallen a document that very powerful people had very much wanted to keep hidden away. It told her two important things: that she had sources close to the very center of the case, and that the official story had cracks in it wide enough to slip a hand through. From that moment on, Dorothy Kilgallen was no longer simply covering the Kennedy assassination. She was actively hunting it. She believed she was getting genuinely close to something real. And in the world she moved through, getting close to something real about Dallas was not a safe place to be. The investigation that would go on to consume the last 18 months of her life had now begun in earnest, and so, perhaps, had the danger. For the next year and a half, Dorothy Kilgallen lived a double life, stacked on top of another double life. To the public, she was still the same elegant woman on television every Sunday night, still the columnist, faithfully tracking Broadway openings and Hollywood romances. But underneath all of it, she was quietly assembling a case file on the death of a president, paying for her own travel, working her own sources, and doing nearly all of it entirely on her own, with no editor directing her and no team behind her to help. She read everything she could possibly find. The official report and its supporting volumes ran to 26 thick books, and Dorothy worked through them the way a prosecutor works a brief, hunting for the small contradictions, the witnesses who were never followed up, and the details that simply did not fit. She tracked down witnesses. She made telephone calls at strange hours of the night. She followed leads that carried her far outside the safe and glittering world of New York nightclubs. She traveled back to Dallas more than once, walking the ground where it had all happened and talking to people the official investigators seemed to have brushed quickly past. And she began to focus on New Orleans, a city that kept surfacing at the edges of the story. Oswald had spent the summer of 1963 there, and the place seemed full of loose threads that the official report had simply left dangling, tangled up with figures Dorothy found deeply suspicious. Through all of it, she kept her findings inside a single file folder, the very one she carried with her almost everywhere that she went. Friends noticed that she never once let it out of her sight. When it was not in her hands, it was reportedly locked away. She trusted the information to paper, but that paper she trusted to no one at all. She was not at all naive about the risk. This was a woman who deeply understood power and who knew that some of the people circling this story were genuinely dangerous. According to several accounts, she told friends that if she were ever found dead, they should absolutely not believe that it had been an accident. It is the kind of line that sounds far too dramatic in hindsight, but the people who actually knew her insisted that she said it and that she truly meant it. As 1965 wore on, those closest to her sensed both a growing excitement and a growing strain. She genuinely believed she was closing in on the very center of the thing. She spoke of a planned trip to New Orleans to meet a source, someone she believed could finally give her the last piece of the puzzle that she still needed. And in the final weeks of her life, she said the words that would go on to echo for decades after she was gone. She told several people in her close circle that she was about to break the case wide open. In 5 more days, she reportedly said, "I am going to bust this whole thing wide open." And she said versions of the very same thing more than once, to more than one person. Whether those exact words were spoken in precisely that way, we cannot be completely certain. Memory and legend tend to blur together around a death like hers. But the broad picture is remarkably consistent across many of those who knew her. Dorothy Kilgallen, in the autumn of 1965, believed she was only days away from the biggest story of her life. It is worth pausing here to be very honest about what we actually know and about what we simply do not. We do not have her file. We cannot read her conclusions. We cannot check her sources against the evidence because the very heart of her investigation simply vanished. What we have instead is the testimony of the people around her, the documented shape of her movements, and the undisputed fact of what she had already managed to obtain and publish. That is enough to take her completely seriously. It is not, by itself, enough to prove what she believed she had found. And an honest account has to hold both of those truths at the very same time. What we can say for certain is that Dorothy Kilgallen was no crank and no fantasist. She was a disciplined, deeply skeptical, world-class reporter at the absolute top of her profession. When a journalist of that caliber spends 18 full months and risks her own hard-won reputation on a single story, it is genuinely worth asking what she saw that the rest of the country had missed. She had already proven with the Ruby testimony that the official wall built around the case was nowhere near as solid as it appeared from the outside. She had already shown that she had sources willing to take genuine risks to slip her secrets. The real question was how far up and how deep those sources actually went. By November of 1965, the sheer strain of carrying all of this had become visible. She was drinking more, she was sleeping badly, and she was, by every account, deeply exhausted. The relentless double life of a glamorous public star by night and a secret-driven investigator by day was clearly wearing her down. And the people who loved her could see it plainly in her face. Some of those who loved her worried that she was pushing far too hard, chasing something far too big, in a state far too fragile to keep herself safe. Others believed she had simply found the story of a lifetime, and that she could not let it go, no matter what the personal cost to her might turn out to be. Both of those things can be perfectly true at the very same time. A great reporter, worn dangerously thin, gripping the most dangerous story in America and absolutely refusing to put it down. On the evening of November the 7th, 1965, she did exactly what she had done 1,000 times before. She put on her makeup and she went to the television studio. She took her seat on the panel of What's My Line, smiled warmly for the cameras, and was, to the many millions watching at home, the very same Dorothy Kilgallen they had always known. Not one of them could possibly have guessed that this would be the very last time they would ever see her alive. The broadcast ended at 11 o'clock, exactly as it always did. Dorothy Kilgallen left the studio and, just like so many nights before it, she went out into the New York evening. She stopped first at B.J. Clark's, a well-known Manhattan bar, in the company of one of the producers from the program. Staff there would later confirm that they had indeed seen her that night. Sometime after midnight, she moved on alone to the cocktail lounge of the Regency Hotel, a favorite late-night spot of hers on Park Avenue. There, by several accounts, she was seen having a drink with a man. Who exactly that man was has been debated ever since. Researchers have proposed names over the years, but none has ever been firmly established, and the companion, whoever he was, never publicly accounted for that evening. The staff of the Regency, for their part, would never publicly say what they saw or heard that night, And then, at some point in the small hours, Dorothy finally went home. She returned to her townhouse on East 68th Street, the elegant home that she shared with her husband, Richard Colmar, and their family. What happened inside that house in the hours that followed is, in the very end, the question the whole story turns upon, because no one living has ever given a truly complete account of it. The next morning, she did not come down, and as the slow hours passed without her, the household began to grow uneasy. It was her hairdresser, arriving as usual that morning, who eventually went up and found her. Dorothy Kilgallen was in a bedroom on the 3rd floor. She was dead, and almost at once, the small wrong details began to quietly pile up, one strange thing resting on top of another. The first was the room itself. She had been found in a 3rd-floor bedroom that, by the family's own account, she almost never used and almost never actually slept in. The second was how she looked. She was sitting upright, still wearing her full makeup, including her false eyelashes, as though she had never once prepared herself for sleep at all. She was dressed not in the clothing she had worn out that night, but in a fresh robe, a small detail that suggested she had come home, changed, and then somehow ended up in entirely the wrong room. There was a book beside her, open as though she had been reading it. But by several accounts, it was a novel she had told friends she had already put down days earlier. And her reading glasses, the ones she would have needed to read it at all, were not where they ought to have been. The air conditioning unit was running on a cold November night, and the bedside lamp was arranged in a way that did not quite match someone genuinely settling in to read. Each of these things, taken entirely on its own, can be explained away. People are strange in private. Habits break. A tired woman does unusual things at 3 in the morning, but taken all together, they painted a picture that felt, to many who looked at it closely, as though it had been carefully arranged, as though the room were a stage and not a deathbed. To the people who knew her habits well, almost nothing about that final scene looked the way Dorothy Kilgallen actually lived, or slept, or read at the end of a long working night. Then came the medical findings, and they only served to deepen the unease around her death. The New York City medical examiner, Dr. James Luke, determined that Dorothy had died from a combination of alcohol and barbiturates present in her system. The official cause of death was recorded as acute barbiturate and alcohol intoxication. But, crucially, the circumstances themselves were formally listed as undetermined. Undetermined. Not an accident, not a suicide. It could not rule out an accident. It could not rule out suicide. And, most unsettling of all, it could not rule out that someone else had been involved. The full medical authority of the city of New York was, in effect, admitting that it could not actually say what had truly happened. The toxicology raised its own difficult questions. By some accounts, the mixture of substances found in her body included 3 different sedatives at once, among them at least one that she had no known prescription for, in a combination that puzzled some of those who later reviewed it. It was the kind of result that could come from a careless, exhausted woman taking too many pills with far too much alcohol. It was also the kind of result that could come from something much darker. And then there was the single detail that, more than any other, has kept this case alive for the last 60 years. The file. Dorothy Kilgallen had spent 18 long months building a private investigation into the Kennedy assassination, and she had kept the entirety of it inside a folder she guarded almost obsessively. In the days surrounding her death, that file, along with the notes for the book she had been writing, simply disappeared. They were never logged, never inventoried, and never found. No police report ever documented what became of them. One day, the most important papers in her life were there, and then, very quietly, they were not. The single most valuable thing she owned in terms of the entire story of her life simply evaporated at the exact moment that she could no longer protect it herself. Maybe it was lost in the sheer confusion of a sudden death. Maybe a grieving family simply misplaced it, or maybe someone made very sure that it would never, ever be read. We do not know. That is the honest and deeply frustrating answer. We genuinely do not know who took it, or indeed, if anyone took it at all. What we do know is that a woman who had publicly promised to crack open the assassination of a president was found dead only days later, and that her evidence had vanished right along with her. For those inclined to see a conspiracy, it was all almost too perfect. For those inclined to see a tragedy, it was a sad and ordinary death, merely dressed up by coincidence. The official record closed the matter as an accident, but the medical examiner's own chosen word, undetermined, had left the door open just wide enough for the questions to come pouring through. And come pouring through, they certainly did. Because the story of Dorothy Kilgallen did not end on that cold November morning. In many ways, it was really only just beginning. In the days right after her death, the tributes poured in from every direction. Dorothy Kilgallen had been a fixture in American life for decades, and the whole country genuinely felt the loss. Her colleagues on What's My Line, who had sat beside her every Sunday night for 15 years, were visibly shaken. The show went on, but her chair proved utterly impossible to fill. For a time, the official story held firm. An accidental overdose, a tragic end to a brilliant and deeply exhausting life. And the world moved on, the way that it always does. But the questions themselves never fully went away. They lingered at the edges of the Kennedy assassination literature, quietly surfacing again and again over the passing years. How could it possibly be, people kept asking, that a reporter who swore she was about to break the assassination case wide open had died so suddenly, and that her notes had simply vanished? The grief did not spare her family either. Her husband, Richard Colmar, never fully recovered from the loss of her. In January of 1971, a little more than 5 years after Dorothy died, Colmar took his own life. The once glamorous Park Avenue marriage had ended now in 2 separate tragedies. The whole story might easily have faded into a mere footnote of assassination lore. But then, in 2016, it came roaring back to life. That year, an author and former attorney named Mark Shaw published a book that he called The Reporter Who Knew Too Much. Shaw had spent years digging into Dorothy's death. He had tracked down surviving witnesses, re-examined the forensic record, and laid out a detailed argument that she had not died by accident at all. He believed that her fatal dose had been administered by someone else in order to stop her investigation. The book became a sensation among those who follow the Kennedy case closely, and it managed to do something genuinely remarkable. It convinced actual authorities to take another look. In early 2017, spurred in part by Shaw's book and by a growing public campaign, the Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance Jr., agreed to review the circumstances of Dorothy Kilgallen's death, more than 50 years after the fact. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the questions might finally receive a formal answer. A detective was assigned to it. Shaw turned over everything that he had gathered. An assigned detective reviewed what Shaw had provided. But after an investigation that lasted several months, the district attorney's office quietly closed the matter once again, concluding there was simply not enough solid evidence that she had been murdered to build any kind of case. And that, in a sense, is exactly where the case still sits today. Not proven a murder, not comfortably an accident, suspended once again in that single word the medical examiner had chosen: undetermined. So what are we, a full 60 years later, honestly supposed to make of all of it? It is genuinely tempting to pick a side, to declare confidently that she was silenced by powerful men, or instead, to dismiss the whole thing as a sad accident wrapped up in wishful thinking. But the evidence, when it is examined fairly, simply does not allow for that kind of certainty in either direction, and pretending otherwise would be a real disservice to her memory. So here is what is genuinely solid. Dorothy Kilgallen was a real and formidable investigative journalist and not some idle dabbler. That much is simply not in dispute. She really did obtain and then publish Jack Ruby's secret testimony, embarrassing the authorities and proving that she had sources right at the heart of the case. That is documented fact. She really did tell people that she was close to a breakthrough, and she really did die suddenly, and her assassination research really did disappear. All of those things actually happened. What we simply cannot prove is the link between those things. We cannot show that someone killed her, and we cannot read the file that might finally have told us what it was she knew. The honest position here is the uncomfortable one. It is to say plainly that the death of Dorothy Kilgallen is genuinely unresolved, and that it may very well remain so forever. But perhaps focusing only on the way that she died actually misses the far more important point about the way that she chose to live. For more than 30 years, she had been one of the single most influential voices in all of America, and she had spent that influence on the truth far more often than she ever spent it on herself. Because long before there was ever any mystery, Dorothy Kilgallen was something that the world still badly needs. A reporter who flatly refused to take the easy, official answer. In an era when very few women were handed any real power in journalism at all, she clawed her own way to the very top, without a famous mentor and without an easy path, in newsrooms that were run almost entirely by men. And then she used that hard-won power to ask the hard questions. She had been right about Sam Shepard when the entire official system was wrong, and she was perfectly willing to be right about Dallas too, whatever the cost might finally turn out to be. she understood something that every truly good journalist comes to understand: that the most dangerous words in any society are the simplest ones. That does not add up, whether or not anyone ever truly silenced Dorothy Kilgallen. She spent the very last part of her life trying to make sure that a comfortable story did not get to become the final word. That is a genuine kind of courage, and it is well worth remembering, entirely apart from however her own story happened to end. The file is still missing, the questions are all still open, and somewhere in the gap between what she found and what we are allowed to know, Dorothy Kilgallen is still quietly waiting for an answer. 6 full decades have now passed, and that gap has never once been filled. She was the reporter who knew too much, or perhaps, more simply, the reporter who asked too much, of a world that very much preferred to leave its mysteries quietly alone. Either way, she earned the one thing that every great journalist quietly hopes to leave behind. Not certainty, but a question that simply refuses to die. Thank you for listening.